At 11:20 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Cullen stood in a Normandy field 3 miles southeast of Corentin, staring at a Sherman tank that was still burning. Black smoke poured from the open turret hatch. Inside, the loader had died 6 minutes earlier. Cullen was 29 years old. He had been in Normandy for 37 days. In that time, 11 tanks from his battalion had been destroyed. This one had died the usual way. A German 75mm anti-tank gun, hidden in a hedgerow barely 70 yards away, had waited in silence. The Sherman had done exactly what doctrine required, rammed its nose up the earthen bank to climb the hedge. For a few seconds, its belly armor was exposed. That was all the German gunner needed. One round punched through the thin underside plate. 3 men burned alive. 2 escaped. The tank never fired another shot. It was the same story everywhere in the Norman bocage. By mid-July, First Army had lost more than 200 Sherman tanks in 6 weeks. British operational research teams later confirmed what every American tanker already knew. 60% of Shermans were destroyed by a single hit. 73% of penetrated tanks caught fire. Once a tank stalled on a hedgerow, survival time was measured in seconds. The Sherman's 75mm gun could smash through a hedge, but only after the tank climbed it. And climbing meant death. The bocage wasn't natural terrain. It was engineered over centuries. Norman farmers had stacked stones along property lines since the Middle Ages. Earth piled up. Roots intertwined. Trees and bushes took hold. By 1944, hedgerows stretched across 50 miles of countryside, each one a compacted wall of soil, rock, and vegetation 4 to 15 feet high, anchored by roots as thick as steel cable. Fields averaged 300 feet wide. Sunken lanes connected them. German defenders turned each one into a miniature fortress. American doctrine called for combat engineers to blast holes using 50-pound explosive charges. The explosions worked, but they also acted like flares, instantly drawing anti-tank fire. Some Shermans had bulldozer blades welded to their bows. Those worked when available. Only 60 dozer tanks existed in all of Normandy. Other units welded makeshift rake teeth from railroad ties. Sometimes they worked. Often they didn't. Most attempts ended the same way. A tank climbing a hedge, pausing just long enough to die. Cullen had watched 23 Shermans burn in his sector alone since June 6. He knew the numbers. The 3rd Armored Division had landed in France with 232 tanks. By late July, it would lose 648 Shermans destroyed and another 700 knocked out and repaired, a loss rate of 580%. Every crew knew someone who had died climbing a hedgerow. The problem consumed First Army planning. General Omar Bradley needed a breakthrough. Operation Cobra would launch in less than 2 weeks. The plan required armor to move fast, off roads, across fields. If tanks kept dying on hedgerows, the offensive would stall before it began. On July 12th, during a rare 24-hour break from the line, Cullen walked along Omaha Beach. The beach still looked like a scrapyard from hell. Wrecked landing craft, crushed bunkers, and everywhere, German beach obstacles, cut loose by engineers and dragged above the tide line. Steel crosses, Belgian gates, and Czech hedgehogs. 3 steel I-beams welded together at right angles. The Germans had placed them to stop landing craft. Now they sat in piles, unwanted scrap metal. Cullen looked at the hedgehogs. Then he looked inland, toward the hedgerows that had killed hundreds of American tankers. And he understood something no one else had. The problem wasn't the Sherman. The problem was how it hit the hedge. Cullen returned to his unit that night. He found a welding torch. He cut 4 steel prongs from a demolished Czech hedgehog. By 300 hours on July 14th, he had welded them onto the bow of his Sherman in a configuration no one had tried before. It looked like a steel pitchfork. By dawn, General Bradley would be watching a demonstration. By noon, Cullen would either be court-martialed for destroying Army property, or he would change how armored warfare was fought in Normandy. The difference depended on whether his idea worked. At 0700 on July 14th, Bradley arrived at a test field near St. Lo. Staff officers gathered around a modified Sherman. 4 steel prongs jutted forward at 45-degree angles, each nearly 3 feet long, crudely welded directly to the hull armor. The welds were ugly. The idea looked insane. But nothing else had worked. Bradley gave the signal. The Sherman backed up 50 yards from a hedgerow, 12 feet high, roots buried deep in packed earth. The tank accelerated to 10 miles per hour and drove straight at the wall. The steel prongs hit first. Instead of riding up the hedge, they dug into its base. The tank's weight pushed forward. The prongs acted like tusks, ripping through roots and earth. In 8 seconds, the Sherman punched through the hedgerow and burst out the other side under a shower of dirt and vegetation. The belly armor was never exposed. The gun never stopped pointing forward. The tank remained fully combat-ready. Bradley watched it happen again. Then again. Every time, the hedge collapsed at ground level. Every time, the tank emerged ready to fight. Bradley understood instantly. If every Sherman had these cutters, armor could move through bocage at fighting speed. Tanks could bypass roads, flank German guns, and turn the terrain against the defenders. But Operation Cobra launched in 11 days. First Army fielded over 1,200 medium tanks. Bradley turned to his ordnance officer. The order was blunt. Every workshop, every welder, every torch, make these. The steel would come from German beach obstacles. The design would follow Cullen's prototype. And every cutter that could be built would be installed before July 25th. No blueprints. No supply chain. Just scrap steel, welders, and time running out. The race to break Normandy had begun. The welds were the first problem. They had to bite deep enough into the Sherman's bow plate to survive combat stress, but not so deep that they weakened the armor itself. Each cutter added nearly 800 pounds to the tank's weight. The suspension could handle it, but ordnance officers worried about long-term strain on transmissions and final drives during sustained operations. There was no time for extended testing. The first 20 Rhino tanks reached forward positions near Purriers on July 18th. In demonstrations, the cutters worked perfectly. In combat, new problems emerged immediately. German anti-tank gunners adapted faster than expected. They learned to aim for the prongs themselves. A single 75mm armor-piercing round could shear off a cutter tine, sending razor-sharp steel fragments backward into the crew compartment. 2 Shermans lost their cutters to direct hits before even engaging a hedgerow. Engineers rushed reinforcements, thicker steel, gusset plates, deeper welds, but every improvement cost time. Production dropped from 50 cutters per day to 38. Operation Cobra required at least 500. The math was turning against them. Then the weather intervened. Heavy rain on July 19th flooded ordnance workshops near Isigny. Welding torches shorted out. Generators stalled. For 6 critical hours, production stopped while crews dragged forges under tarps and relocated equipment. 23 cutters were lost to that delay alone. Bradley's timetable allowed zero margin. Operation Cobra was scheduled around precise weather windows for air support on July 25th. If the Rhino tanks weren't ready, the offensive would still go forward, using unmodified Shermans climbing hedgerows and dying the old way. By July 20th, 206 cutters were installed. Progress, but nowhere near enough. 2nd Armored Division needed 160. 4th Armored Division needed 112. 6th Armored Division needed 94. Newly arrived units demanded cutters before entering combat. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Medeiros, 1st Army's Ordnance Officer, requested additional battalions from England. The request was denied. Every available welder was already in France. So the workshops went to 24-hour operations. Crews rotated in 8-hour shifts that turned into 12, then 18. Welders worked until their gloves burned through. Cutting torches overheated. Steel sparks showered the beaches day and night as Czech hedgehogs disappeared into tank bows. German intelligence noticed. Recon patrols reported Shermans with strange steel protrusions. Analysts couldn't identify the purpose, but assumed the modifications were tied to the coming offensive. German orders followed quickly. Anti-tank units were repositioned to cover likely breakthrough routes. The Panzer Lehr Division reinforced defensive belts. 2nd SS Panzer Division moved south of St. Lo. Both were ordered to prioritize destruction of modified American tanks. On July 21st, a Rhino Sherman from the 29th Infantry Division breached a hedgerow under fire near Saint-Jean-de-Day. The cutter worked. The tank punched through in 7 seconds and destroyed a German machine gun nest on the far side, but a Panther 300 yards away struck its right track before it could reverse. The Rhino burned. German commanders learned the breach moment was still dangerous. By midnight, 289 cutters were installed. For days remained. Then the Germans struck the workshops themselves. At 0430 on July 22, German artillery slammed into the ordnance complex near Corinth. 17 shells landed within 200 yards of active welding stations. 3 forges were damaged. 2 supply trucks carrying cut hedgehog steel exploded. 4 welders were wounded. Production halted for 3 hours while equipment was moved again. This was no random bombardment. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had spotted the tank concentrations. 7th Army Artillery had plotted the workshops as priority targets. Every shell cost time. By noon, 321 cutters were installed. 179 still needed. 3 days left. Medeiros issued a brutal order. Strip cutters from destroyed Shermans and install them on operational tanks. The logic was sound. The effect on morale was devastating. Tankers watched burnt-out Rhinos cannibalized for parts. Each cutter salvaged representing a crew that died before Cobra even began. German pressure intensified everywhere. Panzerlehr counterattacked near Pont-Hébert on July 23, pushing American lines back 800 yards. 2 workshops evacuated under direct fire. 34 unfinished cutters were loaded onto trucks. 12 welded onto tanks couldn't be moved and were destroyed with thermite grenades to prevent capture. Weather forecasts worsened. If July 25th was scrubbed, Cobra might launch on the 26th or the 27th, or without air support at all. By midnight on July 23rd, 406 cutters were installed. 94 short. 2 days left. Welders collapsed from exhaustion. Steel quality degraded. Best hedgehogs were gone. Damaged sections with stress fractures were used instead. German defenses hardened. Intelligence reported 18 Panthers, 23 Panzer IVs, and 42 anti-tank guns concentrated in a 5-mile corridor across the planned breakthrough zone. Every Rhino tank would have to prove itself under real fire. On the evening of July 23rd, 2nd Armored Division crews received their modified Shermans. Brief training followed. Drivers learned approach angles. Gunners learned to stay on target while the tank shook violently during breaches. No one knew if the cutters would survive sustained combat. No one knew if German gunners had found a counter. No one knew if 406 Rhino tanks would change the war or simply die faster. At 0600 on July 24th, meteorologists confirmed it. Operation Cobra would launch July 25th. 406 Rhino tanks would have to be enough. At 0940 on July 25th, 1,500 B-17s and B-24s dropped 3,300 tons of bombs across a 12-kilometer corridor northwest of St. Lo. The ground vanished beneath smoke and dust. And at 1,030 hours, 7 infantry divisions and armored battalions rolled forward. The hedgerows were waiting. And this time, the tanks were ready. The Rhino tanks entered the battle at 11:15. They came in with the second wave, rolling south from Marigny, engines roaring beneath the lingering dust cloud left by the bombers. Company A, 2nd Armored Division led the advance. 18 modified Shermans, steel prongs welded to their bows. Crews braced for the moment that would decide whether the invention worked or failed under fire. The first hedgerow rose 14 feet high. Its roots had stopped American tanks for 6 weeks. The lead Rhino accelerated to 12 miles per hour. The steel teeth struck low, not climbing, not lifting the hull. They bit into the earth, ripping through packed soil and century-old roots. The tank pushed forward, engine torque grinding against resistance, and burst through in 6 seconds. The gun never stopped tracking. The second Rhino followed. Then the third. In 4 minutes, 18 Shermans punched through 18 hedgerows, without a single belly exposure. German anti-tank crews had prepared for the old fight. They expected Shermans to crest the hedgerows, to hang for a moment with thin underside armor exposed, easy targets for waiting guns. Instead, American tanks erupted through the base of the hedges already firing, appearing at combat speed where no tank was supposed to be. A Panzer IV, positioned to destroy climbing Shermans, suddenly faced a Rhino that burst through the hedgerow directly in front of it. The engagement lasted 8 seconds. The Panzer burned. By 1300 hours, Rhino-equipped units had driven 3 miles into German defensive depth. Conventional Sherman battalions without cutters advanced less than 800 yards in the same time. The difference was visible, measurable, undeniable. Rhino companies moved cross-country, ignoring roads the Germans had turned into kill zones. Fields became maneuver space. Hedgerows became doorways. Defensive lines designed to channel armor simply collapsed when the armor stopped following predictable paths. The 4th Armored Division committed 97 Rhino tanks south of Coutances on July 26. There they met the heaviest resistance of Operation Cobra. Panzer Lehr Division had layered anti-tank guns along every road junction, every gap in the hedgerows. The conventional approach would have funneled American armor straight into prepared fire. Instead, the Rhinos cut new paths. Tanks appeared behind German positions that believed themselves secure. Gun crews turned too late. Infantry found armor emerging from fields they thought impassable. Sergeant Curtis Cullen's original prototype Sherman entered combat near Canassie on July 27. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron used 8 Rhino tanks to tear openings for following infantry. Cullen's tank alone made 14 separate hedge penetrations in 6 hours of continuous fighting. The prongs bent. The welds showed stress cracks. But they held. The Sherman never exposed its belly armor once. By July 28, the German defensive crust was broken. The bocage that had consumed 6 weeks and hundreds of tanks was no longer a barrier. It was just terrain. Rhino-equipped units reached open country south of the hedgerow belt. 3rd Army activated under General Patton, and exploitation began. Columns that would have died in the hedges were now racing toward Avranches and the Brittany breakout. Final counts told the story. Between July 14th and July 26th, 493 hedge cutters were built. 12 days, not 11, but close enough. Roughly 60% of 1st Army's medium tanks carried the modification by the time Cobra succeeded. The British took notice. They requested their own version immediately. 600 Mark I cutters arrived from England by August. Another 1,500 Mark II and Mark III variants followed for Sherman and Cromwell tanks. The bocage campaign had cost the U.S. Army over 500 Shermans in 7 weeks. Operation Cobra, supported by Rhino tanks, broke the stalemate in 4 days. Tank losses during the breakthrough dropped 40% compared to June and early July averages. The devices worked. German doctrine built around stopping tanks at hedgerows collapsed the moment hedgerows stopped working. But success created problems no one had anticipated. And those problems would decide how the story was remembered. The publicity began immediately. Within 48 hours, war correspondents were filing stories about Rhino tanks. Newsreels showed Shermans tearing through hedgerows. Radio broadcasts praised the breakthrough. And every report named Sergeant Curtis Cullen as the sole inventor. Cullen knew the story wasn't true. The idea hadn't begun with him alone. Weeks earlier, during a casual conversation, a Tennessee private everyone called Roberts had suggested mounting saw teeth on tank bows. Most men laughed. Cullen didn't. He built the prototype, but the idea hadn't been his alone. Cullen tried to correct the record. Public affairs ignored him. The Army needed one inventor, one hero, one clean narrative. A New Jersey sergeant turning German scrap into victory fit perfectly. Adding Roberts complicated the story, so Roberts vanished. Cullen argued for weeks. No one listened. The problem went deeper. Cullen wasn't the only one. The 79th Infantry Division built a cutter in early July. 19 Corps demonstrated prong devices by July 5th. V-Corps units fielded brush cutters and green dozers. Lieutenant Charles Green of the 704th Tank Battalion built working railroad tie prongs before Cullen welded his first prototype. This was multiple invention, common in combat. Soldiers facing identical problems arrived at similar solutions independently. But history rarely remembers multiple inventors. It remembers whoever arrived first at headquarters. Cullen's timing won. Others were forgotten. By August, historians were already questioning the Rhino's legend. Later analysis noted the devices were not universally issued. Official campaign histories argued that while cutters restored mobility, tanks during the breakout often advanced along roads rather than cross-country. The tools worked. Whether they won the battle, or simply gave soldiers confidence when they needed it most, remained debated. But for the men who watched Shermans stop burning at hedgerows, for the crews who drove through fields instead of dying on embankments, the answer was simple. The Rhino didn't just change tactics. It changed survival. The Rhino tanks solved the hedgerows. They did not solve the war. As American forces pushed beyond the bocage in early August, new problems emerged, ones Cullen had never designed the cutters to face. The steel prongs added nearly 800 pounds to the front of each Sherman. In open country, that extra weight reduced the tank's already limited operational range. Fuel consumption increased. Suspension components wore faster. Engines ran hotter during long road marches. In towns and villages, the prongs became liabilities. They snagged on rubble, hooked collapsed walls, and jammed against wreckage in streets never meant for armored traffic. In river crossings, the cutters disrupted water flow around the hull, increasing drag and making fording unpredictable and dangerous. Crews reported tanks yawing sideways mid-crossing, sucked toward riverbanks or submerged debris. And there was another problem. Once the hedgerows were gone, the cutters were useless and nearly impossible to remove without cutting torches. What had been a life-saving modification in July became dead weight in August. By mid-August, the 2nd Armored Division began cutting the Rhino prongs off their tanks. The 4th Armored Division kept theirs longer, through September, but combat reports showed almost no hedge engagements after Cobra. The battle had moved on. British production continued anyway. Factories in England kept turning out prong devices through the autumn. By the time they reached the continent, Allied forces had already broken free of the bocage. 1,500 cutters arrived for terrain that no longer mattered. The solution had arrived too late to be fully used, and too early to be remembered clearly. Sergeant Curtis Cullen received the Legion of Merit in September 1944 for exceptional service. The citation mentioned the hedge cutter but offered no detail, no explanation, no acknowledgement of how close the breakthrough had come to failure without it. He was never promoted. Private Roberts, whose offhand suggestion helped spark the idea, received no recognition at all. The other inventors, lieutenants, corporals, engineers across Normandy, vanished completely from the record. By October, when First Army stalled again in the Hurtgen Forest, facing minefields, dense woods, and fortified villages, the Rhino tanks were already history. The war demanded new solutions. On November 23, 1944, Curtis Cullen stepped on a landmine during operations in the forest. The explosion severed his right leg below the knee. He survived. Evacuated to England, then to the United States in early 1945, Cullen watched the rest of the war from hospital beds and rehabilitation wards. The invention that had saved hundreds of tanks and crews in July fought on without him, and then faded. He returned to civilian life after the war, married Bernice Enright in 1945, settled in New York City, took a job as a salesman with Skinley Industries, learned to walk with a prosthetic leg, built a quiet life. He rarely spoke about Normandy. When he did, he always mentioned Roberts first. That correction never reached the history books. The Rhino tanks themselves disappeared quickly. Most cutters were cut off Sherman hulls during post-combat refurbishment. The steel went to scrap yards. A few modified tanks survived in museums, but the prongs were often missing or replaced with replicas made decades later. The real artifacts of July 1944 mostly vanished. What remained was the story. Official U.S. Army histories mentioned the Rhino briefly. British accounts credited artillery and air power more heavily. Soviet doctrine ignored the concept entirely, focused on mass armor in open terrain. The innovation that war correspondents had called revolutionary in July became a marginal footnote by peacetime. But legends don't follow footnotes. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and mentioned Cullen by name. He didn't talk about steel prongs or weld angles. He talked about morale. About the moment troops realized the hedgerows no longer meant death. About the confidence that followed. That was the real impact. The Rhino didn't just change how tanks moved through Normandy. It changed how soldiers believed the war could be won. And sometimes, belief matters as much as steel. Bradley included the Rhino demonstration in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951. Walter Cronkite asked Eisenhower about it during the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964. By then, the divide was permanent. Historians questioned the Rhino's tactical impact. Veterans remembered the moment their odds changed. Tank crews who fought in Normandy swore the cutters saved their lives. Operational researchers later found the statistical correlation weaker than legend suggested. Both were right. The device worked, but its importance depended on the question being asked. Curtis Cullen died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. Obituaries mentioned his war service. Some recalled the hedgerow cutter. Most readers barely noticed. Normandy was 19 years past. Korea had come and gone. Vietnam was escalating. A cavalry sergeant who welded steel prongs onto tanks felt like ancient history. Sometime in the 1980s, Cullen's hometown of Cranford, New Jersey, installed a memorial plaque on a boulder outside the municipal building. It credited Cullen with the invention that helped break the bocage stalemate. Roberts was not mentioned. The other inventors, men from different divisions who solved the same problem independently, were not acknowledged either. The simplified story had won. Modern military historians still debate the Rhino's actual contribution to Operation Cobra. Max Hastings credited it with restoring Allied maneuverability. Chester Wilmot called it essential to the breakthrough. Stephen Zaloga argued its effectiveness was exaggerated. Martin Blumenson noted that tanks advanced primarily on roads during Cobra, not through fields. The evidence supports all of them, depending on which metric matters most. But one part of the story is not disputed. 493 functional devices were built in 12 days. No factory support, no blueprints, no supply chain, just scrap steel, portable forges, welding torches, and the certainty that July 25th was coming whether anyone was ready or not. That achievement remains verifiable regardless of tactical debate. The Rhino tanks displayed in museums today were replica cutters. The original prongs, cut from German beach obstacles, are gone. The welds Cullen laid down at 0300 on July 14th no longer exist. The Sherman he modified was almost certainly scrapped by 1946. The physical evidence has vanished. What survives is memory, and memory is both more durable and less reliable than steel. 80 years later, the story of Sergeant Cullen and his pitchfork tanks appears in documentaries, books, and YouTube videos. Some versions are accurate. Many are not. No one can ask Cullen to correct the record anymore. He has been dead for 61 years. Roberts has been gone even longer. The men who actually lived this history are all gone. So the question that matters now is not whether the Rhino changed Operation Cobra. The question is this: what happens when ordinary soldiers face impossible problems with limited resources and no time? Cullen was not an engineer. He was a 29-year-old cavalry sergeant who looked at scrap metal and saw a solution. Roberts was a private whose suggestion everyone laughed at. And 493 ordnance workers were welders who chose not to sleep for 12 days. Military innovation in 1944 did not come from laboratories or procurement offices. It came from hedgerow fields where men died climbing earthen banks. It came from watching the 73rd Sherman in your battalion burn because nobody had solved the problem yet. It came from the certainty that delay meant death. The bocage killed hundreds of American tankers between June and July. The Rhino did not save all of them. Some crews died in modified Shermans. Some died after the breakthrough succeeded. War never offers perfect solutions. But tank losses dropped 40% during Cobra compared to the previous 6 weeks. 40% meant hundreds of men who went home instead of burning in Norman fields. The mathematics of survival are brutal and simple. Cullen spent 18 years after the war trying to credit Roberts. He failed. The Army wanted one hero. One story. One lesson. The lesson it chose was that individual initiative changes campaigns. Not collaboration. Not multiple invention. Not the messy reality of simultaneous solutions born from desperation. Just one sergeant with a welding torch and an idea. But the real lesson is different. The real lesson is that 11 days mattered. 12, if you count honestly. That is how long it took to go from prototype to 500 operational devices deployed across an army. No committees. No feasibility studies. No procurement cycles. Just Bradley saying build them. Medeiros saying yes. And hundreds of exhausted men finishing the job because the alternative was unacceptable. Modern militaries cannot replicate that timeline. Modern systems require safety reviews, environmental impact statements, competitive bidding, and oversight, protections that exist for good reasons. But they guarantee that no future army will ever build 500 of anything in 12 days using scrap metal and field welds. That kind of desperate innovation belonged to a specific moment in history, and that moment is gone. What remains is the memory of men who solved an unsolvable problem because watching more friends die was not an option. Cullen welding prongs at 0300 because the demonstration was at 0700. Medeiros ordering round-the-clock shifts because Operation Cobra did not care about production schedules. Tank crews learning a new tactic in 4 hours because the attack launched the next morning. That is the real legacy of the Rhino tanks. Not the steel, not the legend, but the refusal to accept that nothing could be done.